So basically what I want to talk about is two philosophers, two political ideas, contrasting Confucius, who's an ancient Chinese philosopher, with Machiavelli, who's an Italian Renaissance philosopher, who's whereas Confucius is sort of the collectivist, Machiavelli is sort of the individualist. And what they're giving us is an account of how should power be wielded, how should power be used, what should somebody in a position of power and authority do in a position of leadership or authority. Okay, and they're going to have two very different stances on it. And I also then want to unpack Machiavelli a little bit further. I sent you guys the documentary that I want you to watch on Machiavelli, but I want to unpack Machiavelli a little bit further because Machiavelli touches upon something which I think is important from an ethical standpoint, which is the sort of the practical aspect of morality and ethics. We can talk about these ethical issues all day long, and we can know sort of philosophically and theoretically and argumentatively why something is good or why something is bad, and we can articulate it quite well. But then the other point is, well, then how does that sort of translate into real world matters? How can that potentially alter policies or change, societal behaviors and so on? And that's where Machiavelli is sort of interesting to study, more as a kind of, not as giving us an ethical theory, but as giving us sort of a strategy to practically implement the things that we want to act upon. Because that's kind of what he's going to say. He's going to say, if you're only dealing with the sort of the theoretical or the utopian, you're not that much further in advancing your cause. So that's the point that I want to make, is that how do you fundamentally enact the change that you would like to see? And let me try to put it this way, is you're not going to be able to, regrettably, you're not going to convince somebody with a strong moral argument, okay? What Machiavelli is going to say is things are fundamentally going to change when people's wallets are affected, okay? Either, oil prices go up and people consider buying an electric car or start driving their bicycles. Things only change when people are directly, immediately impacted in terms of their wallet, okay? So if you want something to change, you fundamentally have to strategize in practical terms to impact the wallets of the people that are invested in the status quo, okay? Now, how do you do that? That's the whole point, okay? And then he gives us kind of some points on that. But this is a very important point, because that's what he says. He says, in a sense, you can have all the best ideas in the world. You can be a saint. You can be morally correct and have all the facts and all the arguments. But if you do not, you also need to know how to play the game. If you do not know how to play the game and bring about real world results, then all of your utopian ideas and all of your morals and all of your virtue and all of your, utilitarian plans for a better future, they all amount to nothing. You have to be able to know how to operate within the world and within the circumstances, the geopolitical, societal, cultural environment that you presently find yourself in, okay? It's not enough to say, well, I was a good person, but society was corrupt. And if society wasn't so corrupted, then my ideas would have worked. Machiavelli would say, it's too bad, okay? What matters is, were you able to fundamentally act on your ideas or not? No, you weren't able to act on your ideas, then I don't want to hear how good they are, okay? I don't want to hear how good and how wonderful they would have been, okay? I want to know what was. So that's a very important point. So that's why I want to spend a little bit more time talking about Machiavelli. So this idea of, for instance, a quote from William Blake: "An active evil is better than a passive good." Again, you have to sort of know how to play the system. That he says, if you are a politician, all of your principles and all your ideals, if you do not know how to play the game and survive however you want to understand it, okay, literal survival or political survival, then your ideas amount to nothing, no matter how good your ideas are. Let me put it this way, okay, because now we also have to criticize Machiavelli, because it can start to become very sort of crude. It can start to become very sort of brutish, you know, this whole idea of necessity. They spend quite a bit of time talking about that in the documentary, that you can use this idea that I had to do it, you know what I mean? Like, as in a self-defense context. I had to kill him because he was going to kill me. In some sense, that's true. And in some sense, that's justified. But we then use that justification of it was necessary, it was a matter of life and death, it was a matter of survival. We use that to justify all kinds of behaviors and decisions which maybe aren't truly justified. In other words, we use it as rationalization. Let me give you two examples of that, okay? It's kind of like what the US military uses as an argument for dropping bombs on people in countries where they are not officially militarily involved in, like, you know, dropping bombs on people in Somalia with drone strikes. You can always say, we're doing it fundamentally out of necessity because this is preemptive defense. If we don't drop bombs on them with drones, which they have no possibility of defending themselves against, then maybe they're gonna, you know, gather up some AKs and some explosives, and they're gonna wage war on our territory. So the theoretical idea that that might happen in the future gives us the actual authorization to actually kill them now. Okay, that's it. Almost ends up becoming a farce of the idea of necessity. It becomes an exaggeration of the idea of necessity. Okay, like I forget where I came across this, but somebody online, you know, I forget what it was, basically said like, what you call toxic masculinity, I call surviving in the real world. That's very Machiavellian in a way. Okay, now I'm not sure if that's true or if that's false. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if what we would call, you know, a sort of aggressive machismo and all this stuff is that a necessary requisite for surviving in the real world. You know, I'm a realist. You know, I'm not fantasy. I'm not a utopian. You know, is that necessary, or is it a justification for obsolete behavior? That's my point. Okay, and just to sort of I guess this is a side point, but a sort of interesting point. I heard this on the radio. Okay, and I heard this on PBS. They were interviewing some political commentators, and they basically interviewed people that voted Republican and people that voted Democrat, and they asked them, what is your outlook on the world? Okay, and they asked basically, is the world a good and happy place, or is it an evil and dangerous place? And people that voted Democrats overwhelmingly voted the world is a good and happy place. Okay, and we need to sort of, you know, hold hands and work together, and you know, take long bike rides and walk on the beach and do yoga, you know, and the Republicans were, the majority of them said, this is a kind of a cruel and evil world, and it's getting worse. Okay, so from that idea, you know, I'm not going to trust foreigners. I'm going to stockpile weapons. I'm going to go into survivalist mode. You know, and who's right and who's wrong there? And you can see how you can see how the Republican would look at, let's say, the Democrat and say, look at this naive fool, you know, really truly believing that everything is fine and dandy. And you can imagine sort of the Democrat looking at sort of the survivalist Republican and saying, this guy's going a little bit crazy right now. You know what I mean? Like really feeling like your back is up against the wall. And I don't know, me personally, I kind of, you know, depends, you know, some days it's like, well, the end is near, you know what I mean? So it's kind of a survivalist mode. And some other days it's like, you know, it's all good. You know what I mean? We're doing our best, and things are bad, but it seems like in many cases, people and some institutions are on the right track. So I don't know, you know, but that's just the point. So you're going to see sort of that what I would call sort of democratic idea that I just articulated is going to be a little bit closer to Confucius. You have to lead by example, and this sort of Republican idea is going to be that survivalist idea. It's going to be a little bit closer to Machiavelli. Okay, that is basically like, I need to do what I need to do to survive. Actually, there's a very good movie called The Survivalist, which is very, very, very bleak, very, very bleak depiction of what society would look like if there was just a kind of a widespread crash. Okay, it's almost like Lord of the Flies, this reverting back to a kind of a brutal sort of like the Purge, like a brutal sort of anarchy. But there is something very similar. We talked about Thomas Hobbes earlier in the semester. There's something similar between Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli, in that it's this idea of what I called with Thomas Hobbes, this kind of strategic compromise. Okay. In order to play the game, you may have to compromise on some of your principles. But the danger is that once you start compromising on some of your principles, down the line, you end up being an elected official. But now you've completely forgotten all your principles, which is why you want to become an elected official in the first place. Okay. So what Machiavelli would say is, for instance, I have Immanuel Kant here, you must do it. Machiavelli is going to say, no, sometimes you don't do it. Okay. Even though you think you must do it, sometimes you just don't do it. Sometimes you have to lie. Sometimes you have to be violent. Sometimes you have to be, you have to be brutal. So even though you must do it, forget your moral principles. That's what he's going to say. If you're always abiding by your moral principles, it's going to bring you to ruin. Okay, so let's proceed here. Let's jump into this. So here are these two philosophers, and they're interested in basically that position of authority. Okay, what should be the virtues? What should be the characteristics of anybody who is in a position of authority? Now, we're not only talking about politicians. Anybody who's in a position of leadership and authority. Okay, how should they wield that power? And they come up with two very different answers. Okay, again, two old philosophers, one of them about 500 years old, and the other one about 2,500 years old. Okay, but there's also a few similarities in terms of the geopolitical circumstances that they find themselves in, and so on. So just going back to this here, when we talked about Thomas Hobbes sounds like social contract theory. Okay, everybody has to surrender some of their power. You compromise in order so that we can all sort of collectively work together, because that is in our best interest. It's in your best interest to acknowledge the interests of other people. That would be social contract theory. What Confucius is sort of articulating is what we call evolution theory, that you see the state as an extended family, and it's sort of viewed and structured in a similar way. Okay, the structure of hierarchy. In this case, it would be a kind of a patriarchy, the structure of obedience, and it would be sort of this kind of yin-yang thing. Not yin-yang is the wrong word, but it's kind of the microcosm and the macrocosm are sort of reflections of each other in a way. So the state, the nation state, is a sort of the extended family. And it seems to sort of emerge naturally. Machiavelli is talking more about what you would call force theory. Okay, force theory is basically the state uses force to make individuals or the subordinates submit to a central authority. That is basically what power is, and that's what power is used for. And again, you can see you can also make power into the point itself. You want power just for the sake of power. And I think that's kind of what you would have if you have sort of Machiavelli gone astray. It's only about power. Okay, don't talk to me about laws or what is right and what is wrong. There's only one fundamental game in this human world, and it's who calls the shots. Okay, and you say, oh, it's king of the hill. I want to be the person that's going to call the shots, but then there's somebody else. So then there's all this kind of, I've never seen Game of Thrones. Okay, some of you might be shocked by that. How this, or maybe maybe you're happy for me, that if I ever get into it, I'm going to be police or something. But I would imagine it's something like that. Like it's very sort of cutthroat and strategizing and violating principles and so on. And Machiavelli is also talking about the era in which he lived. There were all these ruling families in Florence that were some of them more brutal than the others. You had the Borgias and the Medicis and so on. So let's talk about Confucius, and I'm going to try to go through this quickly. Let me skip over this. So again, a very different assumption from what Machiavelli is going to give us is Confucius starts off almost more similar to Socrates with this basic assumption that people are basically good. Okay, people generally tend towards virtue, and that if they do not tend or move towards virtue naturally, they should not be punished. They should be pitied. And they should be re-educated. Okay, in the same way that Socrates says you should pity somebody who lacks virtue because they have not seen the goodness, they have not seen the beauty of the goodness of morality. That you would pity them in the way that you would pity somebody who's lost, and that you would try to educate them. Confucius is basically saying the same thing. People will mend their ways in accordance with their inherent goodness, especially if good examples are set for them. And so Confucius says the person who is in the position of authority, the leader, should be the sort of model of virtue. He should be the exemplar. Because if he can't abide by some virtuous standard, then why should he expect his subordinates to do so? So Confucius would say basically, the ruler should be out front in a way. The ruler, let's say, if you're talking about, let's say, a ruler as in, let's say, a military commander, the military commander that is ruling his troops, that is commanding his troops, should be in front. He should be the first one out there. Okay. Whereas Machiavelli would say, no, don't do that. You're going to die. You should stay in the back and let your subordinates do the work for you. Okay. And you see, maybe there's sort of some truth to both of them. There's something else that I wanted to add here. But is there an element of truth to this? Okay. Now, this is also from some political commentators that I heard, if not the same political commentators. And they're saying how, if you just take, let's say, the United States of America, for instance, the presidency of the United States, that person in office sets the sort of the character of the nation. That person, what he does and what he says, sets the character of the nation. You know what I mean? And I think that we saw that with Trump. If the person who is sort of in charge, I don't know, you wouldn't think that Americans are so kind of obedient to a person in authority, but it does seem to, I don't know, maybe there's something deeper in the human psyche. But let's say, if Trump allows himself to be sort of vulgar and make racist comments, then you see it sort of being allowed collectively, and you see it becoming a sort of a normalized behavior. So there's something, Confucius is sort of correct in that if the person who is, let's say, like a parent, okay, there's a good story in Aesop's fable, of the crab, and the mother crab looks at the baby crab and says, "Why are you walking all crooked?" And the baby crab says, "Well, mother, I just do whatever you do. So maybe it should be a self-reflection on yourself." That's the point. Is if the rulers cannot be expected to abide by the rules that they are advocating, then why should anybody else? Seems to be pretty straightforward. Okay. So let's proceed. So we have this idea that man is inherently good if good examples are set for him. Obedience and respect for authority is central. This sort of family hierarchy. Rulers should lead by example. And here we have the collectivist perspective. The individual self does not matter that much. What matters is sort of the collective. So Confucius says, apart from human relations, there is no self. The self is just a center of relationships. You are a node in a network rather than a specific independent entity. The self is constructed through its interactions with others and is defined by the sum of its social rules. Okay, let's proceed here. So this is actually a similar a point of commonality between Confucius and Machiavelli. They both find themselves in a geopolitical context where there are a bunch of divided dynasties or tribes or families that are at war with each other. And they both seem to have the same central goal, which is the unification. Like basically that sort of Hobbesian idea, okay? Let's come together, let's work collectively and form a nation state. And Machiavelli is advocating for the same thing, that instead of having Italy as a nation state did not exist. It was just all of these kingdoms. And he was saying we need to sort of, unify, and in doing so also fortify. So it's interesting that they find themselves in a similar geopolitical circumstance, and they are advocating for the same ultimate goal in that geopolitical circumstance, but the means by which they want to achieve that goal of a unified nation state is quite different. Okay, let me skip over this. I'm going quickly here. So again, this idea of the ruler as the example says, if the ruler is upright, then the people will be upright. That the ruler should be regarded as a kind of a father figure, and if he rules nobly, the father figure will be sort of loved and respected by his subordinates. That is to say, he will be like his citizens are sort of like his children, and it's viewed in that relationship. There's something that I want to add here, a point of contrast with Machiavelli. Let me go. Let me just go this one. This is also a very, very different point from what Machiavelli is going to say. Is again, you see that sort of necessary dependence, necessary mutual dependence of, let's say, father defined in terms of, I am father because you are my child. Okay, I am ruler because you are my constituent. I cannot be a ruler independently. Otherwise you're like Ozymandias. You're the king of nothing. A king who exploits the people for his personal gain is like a man who eats at his own thigh to feed himself. You are undermining the very principle of what you ought to be setting out to do, which is the sort of the collective good. Machiavelli is going to say, in some sense, the opposite. Okay, he has a much more bleak look on the constituents of a ruler. That the constituents can basically be lied to. The constituents are basically simpletons. That he who wants to deceive will always find somebody who will allow themselves to be deceived. So that's also another point of contrast. So let's get into this now, Machiavelli. So what I want to do is give you a sort of a quick overview of the idea here. We've already gotten some points with contrast from Machiavelli. A little bit of criticism, trying to understand, well, what's the origin of these ideas, and then actually jump into some of the practical advice that he gives us. Okay, I'm not gonna. It's like a long book where he goes through a lot of political and military history, trying to come up with these sort of life lessons for a politician. I'm just going to give you a few of them. Okay, because again, I think the point is we need to also think about, going back to what I said at the beginning, not only knowing why something is right or wrong, but then knowing how to at least be able to begin thinking about how can we strategize to bring it about. So Machiavelli, Italian Renaissance philosopher, he is, and this is articulated quite well in the documentary, he's a man of the times. About 20 minutes here, so it should be good. He's a man of time. So what is going on in the Renaissance is there is this sort of rejection of what would I call it? Sort of dogma and authority. That you have sort of Galileo all these scientists, Galileo, you have Leonardo da Vinci, okay, biologists are doing autopsies on cadavers to see how it actually works. How does the human body actually work? Galileo is looking through his telescope at the night sky to see what does the empirical data show. Let us forget about the story of how we were told that it's supposed to be and how it was, and let's look to see how it actually is. And Machiavelli is doing, in some sense, the same thing, but with the world of society and politics. Okay, instead of looking at people from this utopian perspective of how we ought to be, let's start from the point of looking at it how it actually is. Let's open our eyes empirically and then take that as our starting point. Okay, instead of imagining fantasies and idealistic ideas that aren't likely to pan out. So again, Machiavelli is in a very similar geopolitical context and is offering a very similar solution to this sort of divided nation of warring kingdoms and states and dynasties. But the means to get there are quite different. So here we get this idea that let's try to contrast it with Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant would say, well, let me see. I'm gonna get my wires crossed here. Machiavelli is gonna say, you can do the wrong thing for the right reason. Okay, you can do the wrong thing for the right reason. In other words, if the result, it's the result that matters. It's very utilitarian in a way. Whereas yeah, I don't know. I guess Immanuel Kant would say the opposite. You can't do the wrong thing for the right reason. I don't know. Now maybe I'm getting my wires crossed there, trying to contrast it with Kant. It is okay to do bad things for a good reason. But now, what do we justify as being a good reason? This goes back to this whole point that I made a little bit earlier of I had to do it. I couldn't have done otherwise. Is it true? Is it true that you could not have done otherwise? Was it true that your back was up against the wall and there truly was no other option, and that you are now justifying it as it was done out of necessity, that I could not have done otherwise? It is okay to do bad things for a good reason. That's very sort of consequentialist, you see. It sounds a little bit like utilitarianism. Okay, let's proceed here, and then we'll also kind of criticize this idea a little bit. There are two theories as to why he wrote this book. First of all, he wrote The Prince. He wrote two books. The first one is The Prince, and the second one is Discourses on Levy. And it seems to be, I'm not too familiar with the second one. Okay, The Prince seems to be the more popular one because it's the more scandalous one. The Prince is basically an analysis of power. Okay, how it is obtained and how it is maintained. And the second book is sort of, now then what are you supposed to do with that power? Okay, and now you could, well, why was this book written? First of all, it was written as a sort of a letter of application. He wanted to be basically a political advisor for one of the ruling families in Florence. And he said, look, I can't make you a good gift. I don't have a lot of money, but what I can offer you is basically my knowledge with regards to political and military history and all the lessons that I've drawn from my studies about military and political history. So he writes this as kind of a letter of application, the book. Okay, and how it has been received, there's basically been two interpretations. Okay, I'm not sure where I stand here. One interpretation was that he wrote this and he was serious. Okay, that he meant and he truly believed everything that he was saying. That it's okay to lie, it's okay to cheat, it's okay to deceive, it's okay to manipulate. That doesn't mean to say that you are necessarily a brutish, violent person, but that he's talking about this in a very utilitarian way. Okay, that violence is a tool, deception is a tool. You should have them at your disposal. But then get into the problem like what we get with the militarization of police. Once you give somebody a tool, they're tempted to use it. Okay. So one interpretation of the book is when he wrote this, he was serious, that he actually meant what he said. the other interpretation of the book is that what he was trying to do was a kind of a humanist project. What he was trying to do was basically he was trying to teach the non-rulers the rules of politics. He was trying to make people that were unaware of how politics actually worked, trying to make them aware of how it worked. That basically he wasn't teaching the ruling classes anything that they didn't know. What he was trying to do was release the tricks of the trade. Okay, he was trying to show the tricks of the magician, expose them for what they really were. Like, look, this is what we think the rulers are, and this is what we think that they're all about, and they pose themselves as pious and virtuous and caring, but they're not. Okay, they're playing this game of power, and they're sort of obsessed with this game of power. That's the second interpretation, that he wrote it more to educate the not politically informed masses rather than to actually give the rulers new tools that presumably they already knew. Okay, and it's gotten mixed receptions. Okay, and Napoleon said that this is the only book worth reading. Mussolini loved it, and Mussolini was an ally of Adolf Hitler, as we know. And I'm going to try to make a point later on that there's at least Adolf Hitler maybe didn't read it, and if he did read this book, there's at least one chapter that he didn't read, because political campaign, a military campaign that was conducted, that if he had read Machiavelli, maybe he wouldn't have conducted that military campaign as he did, which potentially resulted in Adolf Hitler and the Axis forces losing the war. Okay, let me get to the point here. So this is the intention here. This is what he's describing here as his intention. He says, "It is my intention," and he writes this later, quite deep into the book. Okay, book 15. "It being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter rather than the imagination of it. For men have imagined republics and principalities that have never really existed at all. Yet the way men live is so far removed from the way they ought to live that anyone who abandons what is for what should be pursues his downfall rather than his preservation." So you see, that's the point that we were making as well when we were sort of it's a critique of Immanuel Kant, that if you're always abiding by your moral principles, if you're always trying to do what you know in your heart is the right thing to do, and you're not able to know when to compromise, then you are not going to survive. Okay, in however you want to understand that word survival, whether you want to understand it literally or politically or in the business world. Yet the way men live is so far removed from the way they ought to live that anyone who abandons what is for what should be pursues his downfall rather than his preservation. For a man who strives after goodness in all his acts is sure to come to ruin. And this is a very strong point of contrast with Machiavelli, since there are so many men who are not good. So this starts to sound like or imply that people are not inherently good. Maybe people are inherently self-interested and evil, in a point of contrast with Confucius. And hence, this is why, this is why it's good to do bad things for a good reason. It's okay to do bad things for a good reason. It says, hence it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong and to make use of it or not, according to, and the key word here is necessity. How do you define what is necessary? So, that's another example that's used in, and I'll give you actually another example, another military example. The example that's used in the documentary is, for instance, we're approaching the end of the Second World War, and there's this massive conflict which is brewing between Japan and the United States, as was presented by Bradley last class. The justification of the dropping of the atomic bomb, was that necessary? And what would have, in some sense, you never know. So that's kind of the point. Is he's going to say, in some sense, you never know. So it's sort of the point that Machiavelli is making here is it's the winner that writes the history books. The fundamental narrative that is going to be accepted, the dominant narrative, is likely to be the narrative of the winner, who can then, after the fact, say, yes, it was justified, but you could have never in some sense known, you know what I mean? Not many people would have been able to, let's say, do the analysis to know whether or not there were other options or other future alternatives. But that's a very important point, is that there is no fundamental right or wrong with Machiavelli. What matters is the result. And once you're in that position of power, then again, it's the winner that writes the history book. So it's the idea that there are no intrinsic rules. This idea that might makes right. If you win, then you can present a narrative that you were justified in doing what you did all along. Because the truth of the matter is, in the Second World War, both sides committed unbelievable atrocities. Okay, the Germans bombed England like crazy, just random bombing, and vice versa. You know, England destroyed Dresden, and vice. You know, same thing with, you know, Americans destroyed Tokyo with napalm. They destroyed 2 cities with the atomic bomb. But then after the fact, we say we are the good ones, and therefore we are the righteous ones. We are the winners. We are the good ones. We are the righteous ones. And the point is, for the most part, that's sufficient. You know what I mean? Maybe the true historian will know otherwise, but it doesn't matter. Okay, might makes right. If I'm able to basically beat you into submission, me having beaten you into submission, all of a sudden is justified, because you accept that. You also accept that new stance in a way. So he says, where there is no higher court of appeal, one judges by the result. That's what he says. And as you know, in many international matters, there is no higher court of appeal. There is nobody that you fundamentally have to answer to. So it's basically whoever is left standing, they're the ones that is going to tell the story. Wherever there is no higher court of appeal, one judges by the result, and that has been translated to the ends justify the means. And this, let me just give you this one. Let me see how much time I got. Okay, this is, I heard this on the radio the other day. They were talking about 2 military generals towards the end of the Second World War. One of them was Curtis LeMay, and the other one, I forget his name. The other one, whose name I forget, wanted to use a technology which was a kind of a promise of, it was called Norton bomb sight. And it was this idea that a plane traveling at a certain speed at, you know, 10,000, 15,000 feet above the air can drop a bomb with precision. And that if you can wield that technology, you can be able to win a war, because you can break a bridge, you can break a railroad, you can hit a target with precision, and that you don't need to do this sort of mass bombing. And he wanted to take that approach. He said, it's also the means that counts. In other words, it's not just winning the war, but it's winning the war in the most noble way possible, trying to reduce civilian casualties, trying to reduce unnecessary damage. And he had this wonderful intention, but the technology of dropping a bomb out of a plane with precision at that particular time, even though they were advocating for it and they wanted to develop this technology, it wasn't getting there fast enough. So at one point, he basically lost the position of authority, and they gave it to Curtis LeMay. And Curtis LeMay was a bit of a psychopath. And he said, who cares about the means? What matters is the end result, which is Japan needs to surrender. So let's burn down all of Japan, because Japan was basically made out of timber. All the structures were made out of wood. And they had this new material, this new weapon, which was called napalm, which was fantastic for burning down wooden structures. So let's just burn down Tokyo. It doesn't matter how we do it. All that matters is when we declare victory, I'm going to be the general who's in command, and I'm going to be the one that gets the recognition. That's very Machiavellian. Okay. So now let me just get a little bit of advice from Machiavelli, and then we'll conclude. Now, again, this is a book that is read not only by politicians, but anybody who's in a position of authority. Okay, you can be a business leader. It can be, I guess I can use some principles insofar as I have to manage a classroom of students There are some Machiavellian principles that can be employed. But he says, for instance, he talks about, let's say, an inherited kingdom versus a kingdom that was sort of acquired. It's sort of like when the son of a businessman takes over the company, there's a little bit of skepticism, but it's also sort of established. Whereas, let's say, a new owner comes in, the new owner has to sort of establish his merit and so on. He talks about hired help. Okay, he says, if you want somebody to fight and die for you, it's better to convince them of sort of nationalistic and patriotic interests rather than just being a mercenary. A mercenary will not fight. He will be unloyal and cowardly and costly, as opposed to actually somebody who identifies with the cause of, fighting on your behalf, let's say, out of a sense of patriotism or duty to nationalism or something like that. So that's one point. This is the point that I said with Hitler made this mistake, because Napoleon made the mistake. And if Hitler had spent the time studying, he says, in times of peace, study war. See, that's kind of how Machiavelli is. In times of peace, get ready for war. Study war. In other words, always know that it's kind of around the corner. So if Hitler would have done that, he would have realized that the same thing happened to Napoleon. This is a kind of a graph. It's a famous graph showing the population density of Napoleon's troops marching towards Moscow. And there were two factors that they didn't consider. They didn't consider, well, this one was an element of chance, which was it ended up being a much colder winter than expected. And the other factor that they didn't anticipate was how hardcore the Russians were, that when they retreated, they burned down their ancestral homes and they left nothing for the invading army, which is how an invading army sort of gets replenished and they maintain their morale. Is you get to a village and you have animals and you have shelter and you have firewood and all this stuff. They get there and everything was already burned down. So you see the red is the sort of onward march to Moscow, and you see the gradual decimation of the troops. So by the time they actually reach Moscow, they have maybe a fifth of the fighting force that they left with. And then when they leave and they return, they're like maybe 1 in 20 soldiers have survived that whole campaign. And Hitler basically ended up doing the same thing. So this was a contributing factor to him losing the Eastern Front, which was a contributing factor in the Germans losing the Second World War. He talks about reputation. Okay, he says, as a politician, for instance, you don't have to be merciful and faithful and humane and religious. You just have to appear to be. Okay, so the art of dissimulation. It's just enough that you put on a good facade. You don't have to genuinely actually be it. Okay, he talks about, let's say, generosity. He says, if you're too generous, then people will come to expect it. And if you're too stingy, then people will hate you. So you always have to find that kind of balance there. Okay. Again, he has a very bleak view of the ordinary person. He says, he who deceives will always find somebody who will let himself be deceived, because people are so simplistic. People are kind of simpletons. He says, as long as you don't touch their daily bread, and as long as you don't touch their wives, you can do whatever you want. Okay. Let's give me a few more other lessons here. Cruelty and mercy. He says, which one is preferable? Ideally, you would love to be both loved and feared, but in many cases, you cannot have both. You cannot have the ideal circumstance of both being loved and feared. So which one should you prefer? He says, love is better in that it's deeper and it's more long lasting, but it's harder to acquire. So he says, so in terms of, bang for your buck, in terms of value, fear is better. Fear is better because you can get fear much quicker, much easier. It's a much more immediate response. Okay. So if you have to use one, now you understand. This is giving you a sense of the philosophy here. This is a philosophy that we call amoral realism. So again, that realism, in other words, let's look at how things actually operate as opposed to how they're supposed to be. Let's look at how people actually are as opposed to how they should be, and use that as our starting point. And that idea of amoral, that it should be amoral, is not immoral. He's not saying you should be evil, you should be violent, you should be aggressive. But there's no precedent. In other words, what am I trying to say is there's a disregard for morality. Okay, you just do what has to be done in the given circumstance. Now, this is a little bit of a side point here that I should have maybe mentioned earlier. But insofar as you're a realist, you undermine any potential legitimate progress that you can make, which requires some idealism. You know what I mean? If you, in other words, if you're always stuck in the real situation that you find yourself in, because you are sort of, I'm a realist, you know, I approach things conservatively, then you might not progress as quickly as you otherwise could, because you're always, in some sense, stuck in the status quo. What I mean to say by that is this. Let me try to put that a little bit simpler. Is it becomes a kind of what you call a naturalistic fallacy. These are how things are, therefore that's how they ought to be. And he's going to say, if you try to change them too much, then you're being too optimistic, you're being too idealistic. But what you end up doing as a result is you end up being sort of more pessimistic and conservative. So in other words, in order to progress, you do have to be a little bit utopian. You get what I mean? Is that if you're always basing yourself on how things are rather than how they could be, he's going to say, don't worry too much on how things could be. Focus more on how things are. Then you end up, in some sense, artificially upholding the systems that are, as opposed to changing them. So it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you say people are evil and people are violent, and therefore I have to adjust my behavior in accordance with the evil and violent nature of people, you end up playing the same game and you end up perpetuating it. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Okay, so that's also one of the advantages of Machiavelli, is it sort of opens up your eyes to the practical reality of things, and makes you think strategically. The disadvantage is, in some sense, it blinds you to real potential utopian solutions that are actually potentially feasibly attainable, because you overlook them. Okay, what else does he say here? Let's get to some good ones. Honors. This is an interesting one. This is good. This can tell you something about you and about your friends. He says there are 3 types of princes. He says the first one is the virtuoso. He can figure out everything for himself. He's a maverick. Okay, he's good at military affairs. He's good at political affairs. He's good at diplomacy. He's good at economics. He's good at it all. Okay, he says that person is the exception. They are not the norm. Okay, so he says let's just leave that person on the side. The maverick. He says, for the most part, anybody who's in a position of leadership has things that they're good at and has other things that they are not good at. So what a good leader has to do is, and this is not so easy, it's easier said than done, is you have to be able to detect what you yourself do not possess in somebody else. It requires 2 things. Okay, you have to hire staff. But in order to hire staff, you have to do 2 things. You have to be able to detect in the other person what you yourself do not have, which is not an easy thing to do, because you have to recognize the skill or the expertise and the competency in somebody else when you yourself lack it. Okay, so you have to basically be able to say, I myself do not have it, but I'm able to recognize it in somebody else if it presents itself. Okay, you have to not only be able to detect it, but then you also have to be able to bargain with that person so that they'll come and work for you. So you have to be able to detect it and also secure the competency which you yourself do not possess in somebody else. Okay, and he says that person will go on surviving, even though they themselves as an individual are incomplete. They are able to acquire the staff necessary in order to do the job well. The other person, he says, is the person who is incompetent and either does not recognize their incompetency. In other words, that's kind of, I think Trump is a little bit like that. You know what I mean? Or the things where they are incompetent, they are not able to recognize the competency which they themselves lack in other people. You know what I mean? So Trump believes that he's a medical expert, And he's like, oh yeah, all the medical experts are bowing down before me. So he says that person doesn't survive politically because you do not know. And worst case scenario is you don't know that you know, and you think that you know. In other words, you're arrogant. Or you don't know, but you think that you've hired somebody who does know, but they themselves do not know. In other words, you have not been able to detect your lack of competency in somebody else. So he says that person does not survive. So somebody made a point, a student in another class mentioned a sort of Bolsonaro, who's a military man, and therefore, the idea is if you have a hammer, all problems look like nails. The military man, Bolsonaro in Brazil, instead of hiring, that's a kind of point to be made about diversity. You have to hire people that think differently from you so that they can fill in the gaps in your thinking. Whereas Bolsonaro is a military man, and what he did was he hired all his military friends. So now you have basically an echo chamber where you have everybody thinking the same way, and therefore they do not see the problems that arise because they do not detect them, because they all think the same way. And so you have potentially a failing leadership, because you haven't hired some other voice. You've only hired multiples of your own voice. You know what I mean? You haven't really addressed your own limitations. So he says that person does not survive. So the point is, you can tell somebody, you can make a judgment on somebody, even if you do not have access to that person. You can make a judgment on somebody based on their entourage. You say, I do not have access to the prince, but I have access to his diplomats, and his diplomats are idiots. So now I know that the prince is an idiot because he's hired idiots. Okay, so that's an interesting point. Avoid flattery. Let me skip over this point about fortune. He says all political endeavors are half virtue and half fortune. Okay, but then he goes on a little bit of a sexist statement that he makes, but he basically says fortune favors the brave. Okay, fortune, he's talking about Fortuna, the Roman goddess Fortuna, likes young men that are daring. Okay, that I think that line, fortune favors the brave, comes from a translation from Machiavelli. Okay, so let's kind of conclude this a little bit here. Let me see what time I got. Okay, we have to conclude this. We're gonna get kicked off Zoom otherwise. So again, Machiavelli is sort of putting this emphasis on the practical, realistic element rather than solely the sort of utopian and theoretical and abstract. He says, if you want anything done, he's not saying you have to be evil, but if you want anything done, you have to be able to play the game. Okay, you have to be able to know how to affect ultimately people's wallets, to inspire confidence and so on. And so we have a sort of an amoral political realism, a political doctrine of Machiavelli, which denies the relevance of morality in political affairs and holds that craft and deceit are potentially justified in the pursuit and maintenance of political power. So this is the point. If you are not able to survive in the game, if you do not know how to get reelected, then all of the wonderful ideas that you have amount to nothing. And there's no point in even talking about them. Okay. But again, the danger is, as I said, with sort of this naturalistic fallacy, is once you start compromising, you end up only playing the game and you forget why you even wanted to go into politics to begin with. You end up forfeiting so much, you end up compromising so much that you end up forfeiting the fundamental principles that compelled you to act in the first place. So you end up losing yourself. So that's always the potential. So now this is what we get. For instance, there are a bunch of things that kill Americans. Like I think like food poisoning kills more Americans annually than terrorism. But we're not going to wage a war on obesity or diet or food poisoning. But 9/11 happens and we have Osama bin Laden, and then you get this kind of Machiavellian thing, basically at all costs, capture or kill Osama bin Laden at all costs. So you go to war in Afghanistan under some almost legitimate pretext, and then you use that as a kind of a false justification to also go into war into Iraq. And As soon as you're able to capture and kill Osama bin Laden, all of the torturing that was happening in Guantanamo Bay and Bagram prison with, military contractors and CIA, torturing, electrocuting people, humiliating people, waterboarding. Did we get our man? Did we achieve our goal, capture and kill Osama bin Laden? Yes, everything else is justified. Okay, that's very, very Machiavellian. Any questions, comments, reactions to that? Yes, no? Okay, so we'll continue then.